Dragon ends up leading here for that sizing, which I don't really like. Yubetsu could easily have hands like King, Queen, Ace, King, so he has to be a bit more careful. Let's see if Yubetsu decides to trap or just min raise. First hand, we see bit too easy to defend 5-3 suited in the big blind. That's definitely the standard play. These types of pseudo-connected hands play quite well. It's not really much of a 3-bet, but calling is definitely the best play. And bit too easy flops an interesting hand. He flops a gut shot and a backdoor flush draw. He also blocks ace-3 and ace-5 suited pretty well, so this hand will sometimes get check raise bluffed on the flop. Just getting Muna's star to fold a hand like Queen-9 of hearts would be a big victory. A hand which is not only best, but can improve, right? But if you were to check raise, it's not as if Muna's star would be able to call. So versus this small bet, you should be check raising somewhat aggressively. On the one hand, versus a small bet size, you should check raise aggressively, but then again, it is an ace-high board, which is not so great for bit too easy because he doesn't have ace-king, he doesn't have ace-10 suited always, he doesn't have 10s, he doesn't always have hands like ace-queen suited and ace-5 suited, etc. So he cannot go crazy here. So he does just call this time. Probably use an RNG or looked at his opponent and said, versus him, perhaps I don't want to raise as much. And he turns a very bittersweet card because he has 5 high now. At the same time, he has a gut shot and a flush draw. And Muna's star ends up betting here. The issue is that if Muna's star is bluffing, he still always has bit too easy beat, right? So if he's bluffing with, let's say, Queen Jack offsuit and then checks the river unimproved, he's still going to win, right? So bit too easy could maybe end up check raise bluffing this hand. It wouldn't be the worst candidate, as in if Munoz folds a better air hand, that's fine with him. If he ever folds a hand like pocket, you know, let's say a hand like King 10, that's great for him too, right? So I wouldn't hate if bit too easy ended up check raise bluffing here, and he does. He doesn't use a huge sizing because he knows he's behind when it comes to nutted hands, which actually makes a decent amount of sense. And the river does complete the flush, which is, you know, interesting because both guys could definitely have a flush. I would say it's slightly more likely that Munis has a flush. It's also more likely, of course, that he just has the nuts, right? Ace 10, aces, 10s, etc. So bit too easy. It chooses a pretty large bet. It's not the bet size I would use, but okay, it's all right. And if Munis calls here, he almost for sure has an ace. Probably an ace with a club blocker, thinking that bit too easy may be bluffing here with a 10, miss clubs, gut shots, etc. So, nice hand there. Yeah, I wouldn't have played a hand exactly the same. I don't like the river bet as much, the sizing, but I do like the play overall. So I'll give that one an 8 out of 10. And aces versus kings, that looks like it's going to be a 10 out of 10 play. Oh, so we actually see a flat by Yubetsu in middle position, which is interesting, right? So especially versus a larger raise size, this is not so appealing. But if he believes that one of the players behind is absolutely crazy and will just squeeze way too much, let's say, it could be the right play. So Katya squeezes here, pretty large. And bit too easy is obviously going to 4-bet. He can still put in a 4-bet that's not a shove, and I expect Yubetsu to shove, and obviously just get coolered. Bit too easy does indeed shove, and Yubetsu is obviously happily calling. When he gets shoved on, he probably thinks kings or aces are not in bit too easy's range all that often, that bit too easy is more likely to have hand like 10s, jacks, queens, ace, king. So Yubetsu very happily calling it off, even though that's not a good result for him. Oh, that's a pretty first run out. So, it's interesting, right? So bit too easy should usually just 4-bet smaller, but shoving occasionally is fine too. And Yubetsu's play on paper is not so great. But if he thinks Katya's, if Katya's been on a downswing and he's going crazy, why not, right? If he believes one of the blinds will go crazy, why not? So I don't mind the play. So again, 50-100 ante, pretty big game actually. So because there's $120 extra in the pot, you know, fifth of a blind each, people are going to open raise looser. They're going to defend looser. They're going to 3-bet more. They're going to 4-bet more. They're going to call more 4-bets. They're going to shove more. They're just going to be way more aggressive. So you could probably compare this to more like a 13 or 14K no limit game, I would guess. Maybe even larger. So because everybody's just going to play looser. So Yubetsu raises with the Queen 6 offsuit. That's quite a light raise. Maybe he thinks that PokerStars doesn't really call him much or 3-bet him much or that he can just be pushed around. But unless he thinks PokerClucka is a weak player or just a very tight one, this is a very loose raise, right? And PokerClucka obviously is not a tight player. He's a very good player. So limping with the ante in there would be definitely the standard play by Yubetsu. So then he ends up c-betting the 8-6-6. He definitely has to be careful on a board like this because obviously it's a great board for PokerClucka. He has a lot of 6s, a lot of 8s, straight draws, whatever. So I like that the fact that Yubetsu goes for the small bet if he uses a bet size here. And PokerClucka should be doing a lot of raising here because he has a strong range on this board. Obviously, Yubetsu's happy to see that card, right? Because if PokerClucka had King 6 off, that's now less likely. And no draw completes. Having the hardest backup also helps. So PokerClucka goes for a pot size bet, saying, you know, on the flop, maybe he was raising like an underpair or an 8 sometimes. But on the turn, he's definitely only raising and then betting a 6, right? So he goes for a big bet. And this is a great card for Yubetsu because it's unlikely a PokerClucka raised king high on the flop. And if he did, he may not bet full pot on the turn, although it's possible. So it's very unlikely that he is now beat. And with PokerClucka unblocking all of the 10-9, 9-7 type of bluffs, flush draws, you'd probably have to call down here. And PokerClucka might think, well, Yubetsu doesn't have many king highs, so if I shove here with a 6, you know, at worst case scenario, I'm getting called by another 6. Check, check. So PokerClucka was obviously bluffing. I don't think he was betting a hand like ace-8 or queen-8. So he probably had a hand like 7-5 suited, 9-7, 10-9, flush draw, you know, that type of stuff. Maybe some kind of overcard hand like Jack-10 is always possible. So pretty fun hand. What do you think, guys? Kings again. So Yubetsu does 3-bet this time. He thought, well, I didn't like this aces versus kings thing. Let me just go ahead and 3-bet. And Dragon decides to cold call in the small blind. I generally wouldn't really cold call from this position because you're out of position. You invite bit too easy into the pot. You don't have the initiative. You're kind of face up as like, you know, like a kind of like a good hand like this one, but not a great one. So I would end up just 4-betting here or folding. And you can 4-bet somewhat aggressively because Yubetsu is obviously going to 3-bet more aggressively given the ante structure. So ace, queen, jack hits the small blind's cold calling range pretty well, right? So I imagine the Dragon flatting hands like jacks and 10s and 9s and ace, queen, and maybe ace, king, and hands like maybe like 10-9 suited or jack 10 as he does here. So all those hands kind of hit this board quite well. So I don't think Yubetsu gets to just c-bet 1/4 pot and be done with it. He'll probably have to have some checks. And kings make sense to check with, right? You have an average hand which really doesn't want to get check raised. And you also don't really need protection. I mean, the only thing you need protection from is 2 outs, you know, in case villain has an underpair, or let's say, you know, protecting from the, you know, 2 pairs of flushes. Obviously, that's a great card since you now have the nuts. Dragon ends up leading here for that sizing, which I don't really like. Yubetsu could easily have hands like king, queen, ace, king, king, so he has to be a bit more careful. Let's see if Yubetsu decides to trap or just min raise. And Yubetsu raises really large, which I'm not a big fan of, unless he thinks Dragon is just never going to fold against him. And I think Dragon just has to fold turn. Would be a pretty sick spot for an open shove to represent a full house. Let's see if he does it. Nope. And Yubetsu's probably thinking, well, once this guy calls his really large raise and the full house gets there, I may have the best hand, but once my opponent calls, like, is he really going to call me with, you know, a hand like 9-8 suited? Probably not. So it's actually a pretty clever check behind. He understands that he's ahead a lot, but won't really get called by much. So, interesting play. Bit too easy raises ace jack under the gun, very easy raise. Ace 10 offsuit plus would be standard, but there's an ante in there, so you can be quite loose. Again, Dragon decides to flat call here, which makes a lot more sense in a single raise pot. Now the SPR is a little bit larger. I mean, bit too easy does have a wide range open raising here because of the ante, so it makes a bit more sense. And I would say easy call by Kazon. This hand doesn't really want to squeeze for value as a bluff. It's an easy defend, so good job so far. 10-3 deuce is a pretty decent board for all 3 players. I mean, I imagine Dragon having some low pairs sometimes, maybe a 10, some cards around the 10, like, you know, King 9 of Hearts, whatnot. So bit too easy doesn't get to go crazy here. At the same time, it's not like a bad board for him, right? I wonder whether or not he raises threes and deuces under the gun. That definitely matters a bit. So, and K's on, you know, he has hands like ace 10, he probably has hands like jack 10 and king 10 and some flush draws, straight draws, so pretty good range for all three guys. K's on decides to merely call, which is a very tight play, but it's fine to do sometimes. Turns a deuce, which doesn't really help anybody too much. Bit too easy, could have merged better hand like ace deuce suited perhaps. K's on could have called a deuce, but it's pretty unlikely, right? So bit too easy is thinking, well, this guy's never going to fold a 10. I kind of dominate all the other aces that he called with. So I have a heart in my hand blocking some flush draws. Let me just check behind, which is a fine play. And Kazon decides to check here. I'm not sure if he's going to check raise or just check call. When bit too easy bets a flop, he's not representing a ton of ace highs. So Kazon could end up betting, but I think checking is fine. Bit too easy bets. And, you know, Kazon only calls. It's a little bit of a weak play, but it's not the worst one ever. All right, so nines is an easy open raise by Yubetsu, and Dragon once again calls. I don't know what he has. Bitweezy could end up squeezing here with 5-4 suited, but the thing is, the button only has 40-something big blinds, right? So that makes it a bit less appealing. So I like his call, actually. A good play so far. Yubetsu bets here with nines, thinking, well, this hand doesn't, you know, this hand really needs protection. I really don't want to play this hand multi-way as a check, so he decides to bet for value and protection. And bit too easy now, you know, it's a kind of a shitty spot because he's got a 5-high draw, and when Yubetsu bets, he usually has a better draw if he's drawing, right? So, and it's a paired board, so even if the turn is a flush card, it's not as if bit too easy really will get a lot of money out of them. So, but I understand the call. Yubetsu ends up betting again, so he really thinks that nobody has a 10 or pocket 7s or 9-8. The fact that he has two 9s in his hand does help. And bit too easy ends up flatting here. I don't really like that play. Easy check. And showdown. So Yubetsu did an amazing job here of getting absolute max value. So Yubetsu raises again. He's been very active. Poker Clucker can do a combination of 3-betting and calling here. I expect the calls incoming. And he does call. Definitely a fine play. Especially with the ante again, right? There's more money to go after. So Poker Clucker calls here. I mean, putting in 250, but there's 120 extra in the pot. So he gets to play a lot more hands because of that. I would say Dragon should defend the big blind. I like it. And Poker Clucker is very happy to see that flop, obviously. Yubetsu again with the, you know, around half pot bet. In fact, it's exactly a half pot bet. And Poker Clucker knows he's not doing great on this flop, so he will have hands like King Jack, obviously, pocket 4s, but maybe hands like King Queen, but that's about it, right? So versus his multi-way C-bet, he doesn't mind just calling here, maybe letting Dragon check raise. The Queen definitely changes things a little bit because Yubetsu could have a hand like King Queen, maybe has a thin value bet like Queens on the flop. He could have improved to a straight here, so definitely a scary card for everybody unless you have the nuts. And once Yubetsu now checks, I would like to see Poker Clucker bet here. He can definitely threaten Dragon's stack here, and he has the best hand very, very often. And I don't think Yubetsu is just going to go crazy check raising here. Small bet by the Clucker. And Dragon shoves here. I mean, you have the best hand sometimes. The problem is that when you don't, you're almost dead, right? Versus a straight or a bigger 2-pair or a set. So I understand why he shoved, and he is short, but this spot is not as great as it looks. And Poker Clucker is probably not even loving it, but he should definitely call. He beats a couple of random kings, some weaker 2-pairs, maybe an occasional bluff. Maybe a hand like Jack 10 ends up check raise bluffing. And pretty sweet when you get it in with 95.5% equity. And no Jack on the river. No Queen on the river, I'm sorry. Jack wouldn't have mattered. So Poker Clucker ends up limp calling with pocket 5s, which is pretty cool. Limp 3-bet is a little bit loose, especially deep stacked, right? Even though limp call is a little bit tight. So, but I like his play. And Poker Cluck is going to hit limp call he's going to limp call a range that hits this board somewhat well. He's going to limp call some hands like 5-4 suited and 7-5 and 6-4. If he has pocket fives, it's, you know, it's not a stretch to imagine he's got 6s, 7s, 3s. So he hits his board quite well. Let's see if he donks. He does not. And Katya is, you know, he's probably going to mix his flop. So he's got 2 overs and a gut shot. Then again, he doesn't have a backdoor flush draw. So this one's pretty close. So he's probably thinking, well, I don't have a backdoor flush draw in my hand, so let me usually check this one behind. The king is obviously a fantastic card for Katya's check behind range. If he has a hand like, you know, king 6 or king queen or ace king, he's usually going to check behind. So I would expect Poker Cluck to check here. And but he actually decides to bet really small, which is interesting. Poker Cluck is probably thinking he limps a ton of king highs here. And Katya floating, you know, representing a hand like king queen that wants to bet river. So a pretty cool play. Poker Cluck ends up calling, and Katya is representing the king so well, right? I mean, if you had king queen, what would you do? You'd raise pre, you'd probably check back flop, you'd probably just call turn, maybe just raise sometimes, but you probably call turn. And then on the river, well, you don't love the 7, but it's still worth a pretty decent value bet, so you bet 3/4 pot. I mean, he's repping the king perfectly well, so nice play by Katya. And Poker Cluck, well, he can kind of do all 3 things, right? I mean, he could maybe check raise bluff, represent a hand like a 7, or some kind of slow played nutted hand, or he could even call. You know, think he unblocks 8-9, 10-9, 10-8. You know, maybe hands like ace-4 that are turned into a bluff. At the same time, if he thinks that Katya is not bluffing enough, he could even fold. So all 3 options make a lot of sense. Folding, I would say, is probably the weakest option. And he does make the call, so a pretty nice call there. Thinking I block king 5, I block, you know, I unblock a lot of the draws that have like an 8, a 9, a 10 in them. So maybe Katya just floats with a much weaker hand on the turn, like Jack 10. So loose call by Clucka, but pretty cool. I'll give him, I forgot to give ratings. I'll give him an 8.5 out of 10. I'll give Katya a 9.5 out of 10. Even though he lost the hand, I think the play was beautiful. Obviously, pre-flop is standard. Check back flop is pretty cool. Calling turned, you know, having some bluffs on the river is cool on the 7. He represented the king so well. It just didn't work out, right? So, guys, don't be too results-oriented. As you saw right here, Katya's play didn't work out. He lost, you know, $1,700. You can probably live for 10 years in Belarus with $1,700. But at the same time, he still played his hand perfectly well. He just got unlucky, right? So, yeah, good play by both guys. I like it. So bet too easy folds, and you bet to raise 2.5x. Fine sizing. Some guys go even smaller, but it's fine. And Kazan didn't squeeze ace 10, but he does squeeze ace jack, so maybe he's just playing ace jack plus. The small blind is now a bit deeper. That changes things a bit. So I would like to see you bet to 4-bet here. I think Kazan is going to squeeze very, very aggressively. If he were to call, the small blind would probably overcall, and queens is not the type of hand you want to play multi-way. So in this aggressive dynamic, with the loose players, with the antes, I think you can go ahead and 4-bet call queens. Obviously, you're not super happy when you get shoved on, but I think you should go ahead and shove. So I don't like the call that much. Jack 5 deuce is obviously a great board for Kazan. He's going to have jacks, queens, kings, and aces 100%. If you bet to has queens, he probably has jacks as well. So that's the one scary hand that Kazan is worried about. Sorry, but obviously when you have a jack in your hand, it's much less of a worry. So he decides to check here, which is interesting. Betting would definitely be the standard play. Get value from hands like king, queen of diamonds that floated the flop. Get value from worse jacks. So yeah, definitely a standard bet. But maybe he wants to check raise or even be tricky and check call. So he actually does check call, which is interesting. Ubetsu has a pretty clear bet on the turn. I like it. And on the river, well, Ubetsu is thinking like, do I bet half pot? Do I shove? If I shove here, can I get value by worse? And he actually decides to check behind, which I think is a little bit weak. I think he can definitely end up value betting.